Well, it's a new year, and we welcome you back to the Catholic Buzz podcast on this first episode of 2022. We wish you a happy new year. And my name is Father Daniele, and joining me, as always, on the Catholic Buzz is Josh Sullivan over here. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Welcome to you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
My New Year's resolution was to spend less time with the both of you. And then I realized, how can I do that? Yeah. I just can't.
You can't.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to live.
You're supposed to do better things for you.
That's right. I'm supposed to do things that lift me up, not tear me apart. I know. Right? Yeah. It is our first episode of the new year, and so what we're doing, like everyone does at the end of a new year, beginning of a new year, end of an old year, you kind of look back, right? You kind of look back at the previous year, and then people make resolutions for the new year, right? So that's what we're going to do on today's episode. We're going to look back on 2021 and talk about some of the top stories, the top Catholic stories in the year. And I thought it would be kind of neat if we each picked one, right? Because everyone has opinions about what the top story in 2021 is. Of course, in the regular news, there's lots of top stories, right?
Yeah, but
this has not been a boring year in the Catholic Church.
Absolutely not.
Either, right? Yeah.
There's been a lot of things going on.
There really has. Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about some of them because or else they're just lost in time.
But not only that, I think a lot of the stories that came out, we had just finished season 1. And so we haven't actually been able to touch on some of that stuff, you know what I mean, for season 2. So
yeah. Okay, so our homework over the Christmas break was to pick a top story of 2021 in the Catholic world. So you want to share what your stories were?
Yeah, I can go first.
Yeah,
sure.
Mine was the church coming out with the note on morality of using some anti-COVID-19 vaccines.
Ooh,
this was actually released in December
of 2020.
2020. And now...
But applicable in 2021.
Exactly. Yes. And so that's kind of where it came out. So we didn't start talking about it until 2021.
Yes.
And it became a big thing specifically as, countries started making it mandatory and everything else. And so we already had a long discussion on the morality of it.
Right.
But a couple of things that kind of came out of that discussion was probably one of our more heated topics from we got a lot of participation on offline or online, I should say, about stands, whether it be from one side or the other.
Of course, because then people started mandating vaccines and people were looking to the statement from the Vatican to say, what does the church say? Can I get a religious exemption and all that stuff?
That's right.
We're going to talk about Josh's topic of 2021. But first I want to hear what Matt chose. Matt,
so
what was your top story of 2021?
Yeah, maybe it wasn't the most kind of popular story of 2021, but a lot of the kind of more interesting discussions for me are the more kind of buzzworthy. That's going to be a thing.
See what you did there.
Yeah.
See, I saw.
Things that came up in 2021 is with kind of the restrictions, the kind of general restrictions that have been issued by governments. The church and the bishops have kind of had to respond and have placed reasonable restrictions on people's access to the sacraments, and that sparked a lot of discussion about how much authority does a diocese or a bishop have because restricting access to the sacraments. If the church isn't giving the sacraments, what is the church doing?
Right.
So if this is the main function of the church and these restrictions are preventing the church from doing that,
that's good.
It's generated some real interesting discussion.
That's true, because the churches were well, at least in our part of the world, were closed for a chunk of 2021. I remember January through March of 2021, and then again after Easter until June of 2021. Churches were closed.
Yeah, and a whole new dynamic is introduced when you have kind of different restrictions and different allowances for people who are vaccinated and people who are unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
especially in Ontario here, we had a couple of those. You could be full capacity if everyone was vaccinated, but you had to check vaccinations at the door.
Yeah, and what criteria do bishops and dioceses employ to make those kinds of decisions in
that's
kind
good.
of a tricky spot. Yeah,
that's good.
There was a diocese out east who had said that you had to be vaccinated to go to church.
Yeah.
So okay, that's
they
a
recanted
spicy
that later.
story.
Yeah,
we're not getting this. You haven't made this easy, I guess, and I'm not going to make it any easier because my top story of 2021 that I'm going to go with in the Catholic world is, I think, of course, residential schools.
Yeah.
Remember. Of course, it's still ongoing. It's still a story. It's not just something we're looking back at, but at the end of May of 2021, the Kamloops discovery of unmarked graves at residential schools put the residential schools back in the limelight again, and with a renewed sort of sympathy from all of Canada, right? Rightfully so.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church, of course, was sort of thrown into all the mess because of the history between the Catholic Church and the residential schools.
And the Canadian government.
Yeah. Right? So that dominated most of 2021 in the Catholic world, and still is. I mean, just a few weeks ago, there was supposed to be a delegation from Canada with the Indigenous people going to the Vatican. We are expecting a visit from Pope Francis to Canada in 2022. So this is an ongoing story, but I think we're going to sort of pry this story open and look back on what's happened so far and maybe talk about what's going to happen in the future. So these are 3 spicy stories, but they are, I would agree with you guys, these are the top stories of 2021 in the Catholic world, at least in our part of the world.
Yeah, right? For sure.
Yeah. So, Josh, let's go with yours first.
Okay, so the big one that I wanted to bring up, we had a whole episode dedicated to this. So if people are wanting to know what the church says and what the church teaches in this and everything else, go back to that episode because it is. But a couple things came out of it through a lot of discussions that I had with people afterwards. A lot of good points were made and a lot of things. So I just wanted to kind of tweak the position a little bit. One of the things that it says, and I got it up here on my phone somewhere, so I'm just going to read it out. We're going to have these links. Actually, I think if I can do this right, the links are going to be right here on the screen.
Are you trying that?
I'm trying it. Right here. There's going to be, the one link is to the Dignitas Personae, which was written in December 2008. Okay, and then the other one is the note on morality of using some anti-COVID-19 vaccines.
That's from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith of the Vatican.
Yeah. That's right. So that one was released this last year, or December 2020, and that's what spurred the whole conversation. But it referenced the 2008 document, which was the Dignitas Personae, that was written by Pope Benedict. I think it was at the time. Yeah. And it referenced it, but a lot of people seem to glaze over that part. And so I just kind of wanted to point out one of the things that it says, and this is in the footnotes of the first of the letter that came out last year. Okay? And so it references it, and then it specifically gives specific quotes in the bottom of the letter that nobody reads because it's all the reference notes. Okay? Yeah. But somebody pointed out, when illicit action is endorsed by the laws which regulates healthcare and scientific research, it is necessary to distance oneself from the evil aspects of that system in order not to give the impression of certain tolerations or tacit acceptance of actions, which is gravely unjust. Any appearance of acceptance would, in fact, contribute to the growing indifference to, not the approval of, such actions in medical and political circles. So this is a reference point that's in that letter, but it's at the bottom, and it's just a little number. But a lot of people, even when we were reading it, we skipped over. So one of the things that kind of was brought to my attention, we talked about how is this it's not really any different using the cells, the cell lines in the vaccinations. The church has given us authority to do so. Not if there's no other options, right? Which is a big thing. One of the things that it was saying there, the conversation kind of came up. Well, what if Timmy, was murdered? He was murdered, and his kidneys or his heart or could have a transplant could save someone. People were saying, well, you can't in any case use anything that's been associated with sin. So in the case of like an abortion particularly, because the vaccines come from the good of an abortion, we shouldn't be using it at all. And the church says there is some acceptance sometimes, and it comes on a case-by-case basis, but that's why the church weighed in on this one and said, no, you're allowed to use it in this case. The difference between someone being murdered and using their kidney and using an aborted cell line is the fact that murder in all aspects is viewed as wrong.
Of course.
Murder is not acceptable in Canada, let's say.
Yeah.
The difference being that abortion is legal and is not viewed in the eyes of legality as being wrong. In morality, of course it is, but legally it's not. And so that's why it's actually, if we take the vaccination, one of the suggestions in this document is that we should be writing in to the local decision makers, whoever that may be. That might be the MPPs, that might be the local health unit doctors, people in charge, just saying, I do not condone this. Like, I'm receiving the vaccination, but I don't condone it. It's kind of our job as Catholics to say, listen, because if you just are a passive bystander, that's viewed as acceptance.
And that's what your quote there that you read from Dignitas, the document there, Dignitas Personae, right? Yeah. It's basically saying, don't just be a bystander.
No.
In this case, this did make headlines in 2021 because people were up in arms like, hey, this vaccine was made with cell lines from aborted fetuses, babies, right? Yeah. And so that's why everyone was up in arms. But the other document that you mentioned, right, from the Vatican, it says that the licit use of these vaccines does not in any way imply that there is a moral endorsement of the use of cell lines proceeding from aborted fetuses. That's a quote.
That's right,
exactly
from
what it says.
Yeah, right from the thing. Now, and that's exactly it. So when they reference after they say that, the document that it references is the one that's saying our responsibility is to make sure that beyond a shadow of a doubt, people don't mistake us for. It's kind of like St. Paul when they're talking about eating. Do you eat the food of the statue, the meat that's worshipped in front of statues and everything else? And like, the meat's not going to hurt you. You know what I mean? Because our God is more powerful than that, and has this. We know that this has no power, no meaning. But if eating that meat is going to cause someone else to sin, then there's the problem, right? Like that's kind of, you look at the same thing. Taking the vaccination is the church has given us the moral authority to do so without any implication on ours. However, we have to speak out a little bit to say that we don't agree with it, because it could look like we're accepting of abortion if we don't. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So that was just a big.
And point. I just want to make clear there that was an important distinction.
Yeah.
Right. The Vatican is saying there are no other vaccinations available.
That's right.
That comply with church teachings in this instance.
Yeah.
It is morally acceptable to receive this vaccine.
That's right.
But that doesn't mean that we're not going to work towards something that's going to be abortion free, or
exactly. And there's actually now we're talking about a year later, or even a year and a bit later, there are actual vaccinations that they're starting to look at in Canada right now. They haven't been approved yet, but they know that they've started the process of approving. The other thing that's just really important in that line, just to kind of mention, because you have the people, so that's people saying we shouldn't be vaccinated because it's abortion. So the other part of that I want to put out there is that it actually has a line in that letter that's very specific as to you have the moral right to not be vaccinated if you want to, right?
Yeah.
And it's totally in your right to do so. And as Catholics, we should support each other in their own personal decision to do so, whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. Here's the catch. There's a whole paragraph there. If you decide not to be vaccinated, there's a whole outline of what you are now required to do.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying. I think it's worth reading what exactly.
Do you have
it
says,
yeah, okay. Right? Because it says, at the same time, practical reason makes evident that vaccination is not, as a rule, a moral obligation, and that therefore it must be voluntary.
Yes. Yep.
So people shouldn't be forced to get a vaccine. Okay. However, like you said, Josh, it says that this doesn't. It says those who, for the comment, where does it? I'm lost here. It says those who refuse vaccines have a responsibility,
and then it lists that
to do their utmost to avoid by other prophylactic means and appropriate behavior of becoming vehicles for the transmission of the infectious agent. Right? I think it's beautiful. You have a choice not to be vaccinated, but there are responsibilities that come with that too. You can't just be sort of freelance, and you have to do your part to make sure that you're also keeping safe and that you're not passing any virus on to someone else.
Yeah, I think, and the logic of the document, I think, is really, really important because the starting point is in the absence of a completely morally preferable option.
That's right.
Receiving the vaccine is morally permissible, but not morally obligatory.
Exactly.
Because it's pursuant to the common good. That's the object. And in the case where you're not, like, you're exercising your right to not be vaccinated, you are still obligated to the common good to pursue.
That's right.
Wow, so that's
a big
came
one.
From 2021 because there are still people on both sides, right, that are that are just really actually, and you can I sympathize with all sides. There are people who are saying, why won't people get vaccinated? We're trying to do this together. We're trying to protect each other. And, in one sense, they have many good points. On the other side, there are people who are saying, no, I'm not comfortable taking something like that out of my from my conscience, and are doing a pretty good job of being safe, right? And then there's extremes on both ends,
100%.
and so it is a very volatile situation still.
Yeah.
People on both sides will be angry.
Oh yeah,
I think with
it's very politicized,
it's
right?
said,
One side or the other.
But
hard to stay on the fence.
The fact remains that the Vatican has said that Catholics are permitted to receive the vaccines that are available, right? Vaccines should be voluntary, and those who choose not to get it have a responsibility to keep others safe. So that's a wrap up of
that one. Boom, perfect. And it kind of flows right into the next one.
It does kind of flow into your pick, Matt. I thought we were going to move into something that a little easier, but right into something just as intense,
juicy.
Yeah.
So talking about kind of the restrictions issued by governments, and how the church is responding to those. That's not a new situation to 2021. This has been around from the beginning, and one of our first episodes is like, okay, our Sunday obligation has been lifted.
Yeah.
What does church look like? What does our faith look like? Now we're in this kind of unprecedented situation, at least in my kind of faith life, that we are kept from the sacraments by our churches are closed while we're dealing with this pandemic. From there was a lot of response that like, no, you can't close our churches. We should just kind of defy the orders from government, and there's a ton to say there, and we're kind of limited on time. But like, should the church be operating entirely independently from government orders in the first place? And you're like, okay, it caused some people to really examine the relationship between the church and civil authorities. That if we want to have a banquet in the church hall, we have to follow health guidelines. We have to follow, if we want to, under normal circumstances, have the church filled. We have to follow fire code regulations. That like there's a relationship that the church has to governing authorities that has been around for a long time. So for the church to like just say, no, we're going to do our own thing, that's tied up with a lot of other things that are going on.
Remember in 2021, there was a church in Aylmer, Ontario. It was called the Church of God.
Yeah.
Now, this church, I'm not sure what denomination it was, but
they kept meeting.
Yeah. They were like, we're not closing our church.
And with no masks and stuff
no
like
masks,
that.
No nothing.
Yeah.
And I think it came to the point where the police
locked the doors
and gated their church and all these things. Remember, it was a big thing because we were all still in lockdown, like heavy lockdown.
And I think they major fined, because the way that church worked, they major fined the pastor and then the elders of the community as well.
And that's really interesting, because there's a tradition in Western civilization of kind of civil disobedience and conscientious objection, that we just like, okay, if this is an unjust law, we actually have a moral obligation to defy it, or like, but there's this kind of strange relationship that's happening, and throughout 2021, and kind of as the situation evolves, that it's like there's an expectation of accommodation, that we have been given certain religious exemptions, but how much of that is an expectation? It's like Gandhi wasn't applying for charitable status and a tax exemption, like that. It's as part of that history of conscientious objection, you kind of don't expect to be accommodated. You kind of take the consequences of those decisions because you are actually making a principled stand. But what's interesting, or maybe unique to 2021, is that you're introducing the dynamic of some part of the population is vaccinated, some part isn't. And you have restrictions issued by the government that are dividing along those lines and saying, vaccinated people have these permissions, unvaccinated people don't. And the bishops, the people making the decisions about the churches, are put in kind of a tough place about, okay, if we open up a mass to vaccinated people, or if we make vaccination a requirement, which itself is pretty incendiary.
Well, you can't, because yeah.
Well, no, they're in a very difficult spot, because it's like, okay, well, in this case, potentially we're giving more people access to the sacraments than if we're just at a 50% capacity limitation. It's like, but can you stratify the community in that way?
So the one is saying that people can come to mass. If you say not all vaccinated, or you don't go with that rule, then everyone can come to mass, and there's no problem, except that you got to limit the amount of people coming to mass. Yeah. On the other side, you could get more. Like if 90% of the population is vaccinated, then 90% of the population can come to mass, and we can actually fill all the seats in the church. Versus 50%, take down the ropes and all that stuff.
I guess I never thought of it like that.
And the 10% of people that aren't vaccinated, they're not able to come. But we're feeding, let's say, 2,000 people on a Sunday versus 500.
Right.
So
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I know there are some dioceses in Ontario who mandated that priests, parish volunteers, ministers had to be vaccinated, right? And that's not our case in our local diocese here, but there are a number of dioceses that went that way. So the way I'm going to play devil's advocate is a little bit is that for some reason, this situation, like you talked about division. You talked about it's sort of the government mandate saying vaccinated have this allowance, the non-vaccinated have this. Well, the church historically has always reached out to those on the peripheries. In fact, that's one of Pope Francis's favorite things to do is go smell like the sheep and go out to the peripheries. I mean, today, the unvaccinated, who feel like they've had an injustice among them. And I disagree that any policy would prevent them from receiving the sacraments.
Agreed. Yeah. I don't think we're allowed to do that, right? I don't think the church can do that. But I think what you're talking about, kind of when you're talking about priests and people having to be vaccinated, part of that is because they're not able then to go out and reach on the fringes, because they're not allowed into hospitals, they're not allowed into schools, they're not allowed into those places because the government. It's like saying if you're coming to Africa, you have to have your malaria shot. Doesn't matter what you feel about it, but if you're going to be a missionary in Africa, in order to go do missionary work, you have to get that shot. And that's where it kind of becomes a little sketchy for us, because you're dealing also with the morality issue, as well as you're not letting those. So then if you decide not to get vaccinated as a priest, I'm saying, or as a missionary worker in general,
right?
Do we just say, well, those people that are in the hospital, we're not going to force anybody to get vaccinated, so those people aren't going to be ministered to, right? And that's where it's such a, I don't stand on one side or another here. It's such a tricky. I'm glad I'm not a bishop.
and kind of the dynamic that has been around since the beginning is becoming kind of much more clear, and like you have sympathy for the bishops and the people making these decisions, because like even in the beginning, it's like there was a lot of objection that like, our Sunday obligation is lifted, but our churches are closed, and some people even saying like, can we do that? Like if we think about what's at stake, if the sacraments are the source and summit, the most important part of our faith, is like you had initial objections, people saying like, is it even canonically allowed to just kind of shut the doors? And was like,
do we have to go underground?
No, like in the Code of Canon Law, people have rights. The lay faithful have rights to the sacraments. Even initial restrictions on receiving in the hand and not on the tongue.
Right.
People like that. It is a canonical right to be able to receive on the tongue. So people voicing these objections is saying, okay, well, like at what point do you say no, or like when is the bishop not allowed to impose restrictions on the reception of the sacraments, so there are situations where people question the authority of the bishops to make these decisions, but they're like it's in canon law that that they are the discretion of the competent ecclesiastical authority can make these decisions. So like the restrictions placed on the rights of the laity, they happen, well, not all the time, but like something like excommunication is a good example. It's like your rights are suspended for this particular reason, and the goal is to bring you back into the fold, communion and all of that. But like for like tying back to what we were saying about like pursuant to the common good, for the sake of the common good, the rights are momentarily suspended. Right, yeah. It's not a rejection of saying like, no, it's
forever.
But it's like for the time being, this is something that we're.
It was important. It's important to point out on both sides, just to say that like this wasn't an attack against the Catholic Church, right? Like COVID shutting down the churches, it was shutting down all churches, all religious churches, all schools, all. It wasn't just like okay, to me, a lot of the objection would come in if it was just the Catholic churches that were closed or just the Christian churches that were closed because of this pandemic. Then we'd have a lot more reason. Obviously, it would be unjust and we'd have a lot more reason to fight. For that reason, if they just closed down the Jewish temples or just the mosques, again, as Catholics, we would have, I think, a right to stand up and reject, So
yes, and just to close that out, like when the lockdowns first happened, of course we feel bad that people were not able to receive the sacraments. I think there was a new creativity that came from it. Like people were trying to do outdoor masses, trying to do things to help people. And I think now, especially as a priest, looking back, if that's going to happen again, if our churches are closed again, I think we're better equipped now with saying. For sure. This is what we can do within our parameters. I think when it first happened, we were like, well, no one wanted to get, no one wanted to be arrested or do all these things. It was all new. It was new for everyone. But I think now we know better. We know more. We're better equipped to help people receive the sacraments. Okay, we got to move on because we got to talk about my top story of 2021. And we haven't left myself a lot of time. And it's such an important thing to talk about. We did a whole episode
on it,
on the Kamloops discovery anyways, because that was the one that was fresh. And we did a whole episode. Honestly, I must say, I think it was my toughest episode of 2021.
Yeah.
When we look back at our podcasts of 2021,
it's very political. Very. You have to. You want to make sure that you're saying everything. You're not offending, or people can't misinterpret what you're saying. Does that make sense? Because there is some misinterpretation that could be happening.
And I think for me too, it was kind of emotional too.
Yeah.
Right. Like it was. Of course, there's a sadness. About this, especially as a priest. Like in our parish, we have Indigenous parishioners in the community. We work well with the Indigenous community, and so to see this history has come back to haunt us today, and to see the Indigenous people, still hurting from it is what breaks my heart. Right?
Yep.
And so there's so many layers to this, because when we first did that episode in 2021 about the Kamloops discovery,
it would just come out.
That was June.
We have a lot
more, June.
Yeah.
But since then,
there's
been a lot more discoveries at residential school properties across Canada.
There's a lot more facts out too, though. So because the newspaper took that and they love to twist it. I mean, so again, never a good thing, not an okay thing, and a really upsetting discovery. Does that make sense? But a lot of more details came out that maybe the media took it and jumped on and look how bad the Catholic Church is. Some of the things that came out were like some of the ways that these students might have been like. This was in a time where they didn't necessarily record everything. It wasn't like specifically they didn't do it for this school or on like to disrespect somebody. Does that make sense? They did it. That they were probably marked with wooden crosses, because that's the way that they did it back then, because they didn't have like the opportunity to engrave, and people were dying from these things. It's not taking away from in the residential schools and the horrors that were suffered at residential schools, but it's kind of show like it was a good thing that these things came up, but the horrors that we found specifically from the graves, the horrible part about it is that this many kids died.
Sure,
but it wasn't like specifically the teachers or the priests and the nuns that were at the school killed them and tried to hide the bodies.
I see what you're saying now. Yeah. I was a little worried about what you were going to say.
No,
but I see. Yeah, I think for a certain point there that the media made it seem like the church's goal was to murder Indigenous children for a while. That's not the case.
And just hide it and cover it up and stuff.
But in many ways, because of the physical and sexual and emotional,
100%.
Psychological abuse that the Indigenous children suffered, and it's had lasting effects on the Indigenous community.
It wasn't a good thing. I think bringing this forward, like having the graves discovered, What I'm saying, I guess, is that I don't think it's the graves that were the problem. I think it was the idea of the residential schools that was the problem.
Sure, the graves are representing what's happened.
Does that make sense?
The darkness of what's happened. I like actually what Bishop Dowd, our Bishop of the Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie, said in his initial letter in June of 2021. He said, any of us who die have the
right.
Like we have a stone with our name on it.
Yeah.
Right. That's our place. We've lived a life. It's sort of a place where we're remembered. And that was robbed from these children. And I think that's just sad. But I think you're bang on. I don't often say that, but you're bang on. But I think you're bang on that the unmarked graves represent something larger. They represent how these children were treated. They represent the torment that's still sort of going on in the
Indigenous brings it up again,
community. And it sort of robbed the Indigenous peoples of many things in their life and in their communities, right? And that hurt is still going on today. So I know lots of people say the government started these schools and the Catholic Church was just sort of a bystander, But I think it's really important that, like you said, that this came up because I believe when things are brought to the light, it's time to heal. When things are brought to the light, and I think the church has to take responsibility for the part that they played in it,
for sure,
and to be part of the healing process. We do that for everyone. The church, Jesus heals. Jesus is our Savior. Jesus is our Lord. We help people heal every day. Doesn't matter what their situation, what their struggle, whatever it might be. We have a responsibility to own up to what's happened and to help in the healing process.
Yeah, it's like a wound that, because it has been opened a couple of times. Well, there's a reason why it keeps opening up. It's because not all the truth was uncovered.
Sure.
Does that make sense? So
it's like a layered.
Like it's festered. So what we have to do is we have to rip open that wound as much as it hurts.
Sure.
We have to dig out the infection. Dig out, talk, get, like you said, bring the stain to light. And only then can the wound hopefully start to heal. I think having the Pope come to Canada, I think having the Indigenous people leaders go to, when they were going to go to Rome, I don't know if that's still happening. I mean, it was canceled in December.
They're going to reschedule it. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if they've chosen a date yet, but I know that was the plan.
I think all that's working towards it. I hope, I wish, and it won't happen, but I wish that it could be the Indigenous people in the Catholic Church one-on-one talk this out, work it out, and happen. The problem is going to be that you're going to have the media, you're going to have the government, you're going to have, it's so politicized one way or the other, you know what I mean, that's going to come in. Because I think if you can have two people sit down, and again, it's two groups of people, if you will, or even people of the same group, because they're represented in both groups. But if you can have that in a wholesome way, it's kind of like you have a brother and sister talking and trying to reconcile, and then you have the little brother, but do you remember this? Do you remember this? Do you remember that? And then you're like, it's a hard conversation to have with the media flying overhead. Again.
Sure. But I think what's really important is that those conversations happen between the Pope, and the Canadian bishops in October, I believe, released a wholehearted apology on behalf of the entire Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. They have played a major role in the invitation to Pope Francis to come to Canada. They're obviously involved in organizing the delegation to Rome. So you're starting to see these things. And that's what I think was important here. We have to give time for this process of healing to happen.
Yeah.
We have to let those conversations take place. Yeah. We have to let this process, to go to the Vatican, to get the Pope to Canada, to get and to listen to people's stories. That's what Pope Francis, I think, is wanting to do. He wants to hear from the elders. He wants to hear from the knowledge keepers, and he wants to hear their stories so that when he comes to Canada, he can speak profoundly. He could speak to the hearts of the Indigenous people and really be someone who's going to be a major part of the healing process.
Yeah. I think that's at the heart of the Catholic Church, and it doesn't matter what the media says. But I think that is every person involved in the church that I've talked to wants to get to the root of the healing and wants to know, what can we do? How can we do this? What is it that we can do
exactly
to prove that we want to be better, that we've learned from this horrible experience, and that we can move on. Not move on, but you know what I mean. Never forget.
Never forget.
Move forward.
And yeah, exactly.
Move forward, but not forget.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have today. But that was just 3 stories from 2021.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So we didn't even have time to leave prediction of what's going to happen in 2022.
No.
That'd be a whole 6 other episodes, I think, the way we talk, right? But thanks for sharing your top story of 2021. I think it was a good year in review. And of course, we talked a lot about today about people having opinions and different sayings. I know people are going to have their own opinion on what we said, but also on what you think the top story of 2021 was. So you can drop a line in the comments on our Facebook page or our Instagram as well, and tell us what you think the top stories, top Catholic stories of 2021 were. Okay. You can also drop us a line anytime at the Catholic Buzz Podcast at gmail.com. And of course, we send all the complaints right to Matt.
Yeah,
exactly. Thanks for joining us for this year in review. My name is Father Daniele. And for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, you've been watching or listening to the Catholic Buzz.